Welcome all to today's webinar provided by Arizona State University in conjunction with our dear colleagues at USAID and Morocco. We'd like to welcome all of you attending from Morocco and around the world for our first session in a series on universal design for learning. This webinar series topic came from direct requests from our Moroccan higher education colleagues. And so we are thrilled to be able to provide this series for you. This session will provide an introduction to universal design for learning and the principles of universal design generally. And our subsequent sessions will look at deepening our collective understanding of assessment according to universal design for learning. So we hope that you can attend as many of these sessions as your schedule permits. The attendance at this webinar will provide a certificate of completion, and we are pleased to share that for attendees who are able to come to 4 or more sessions, we are pleased to offer a digital badge for participation. And I'd like to just correct myself and say that it is on behalf of the embassy. So thank you very much. So I'm pleased to introduce our panelists today, 2 exceptional colleagues here at Arizona State University. We have Dr. Amber Benedict, Assistant Professor in the Mary Lou Fulton Teachers College, and Dr. John Takamura, Associate Professor in the Herberger Institute of Design and the Arts. They'll be sharing with us today the importance of universal design and universal design for learning in the higher education context. Dr. Benedict, would you mind starting with a brief introduction to your background, followed by Dr. Takamura?
I'd be happy to. Thank you so much for this opportunity to be here with you all and to share about universal design for learning. My name is Dr. Amber Benedict. I'm an assistant professor at the Mary Lou Fulton Teachers College at Arizona State University. And my research and my teaching experiences focus on preparing teachers of students with disabilities, specifically within the content area of literacy. I'm very interested in understanding the ways that we help teachers become more effective, the ways that we measure effectiveness, and how we think about ensuring that all students have access to equitable learning opportunities within their kindergarten through 12th grade classrooms. Thank you, Stuart.
And my name is John Takamura. I'm Associate Professor of Industrial Design here at the Design School in the Herberger Institute at ASU. And my focus is I've had a long career as a practicing designer in industrial design. And then I've had several years in teaching as an academic. And my research focus is basically on equity and justice and looking at universal design as a methodology toward creating better design, innovation, and creativity. And so that is sort of my general focus. I also teach courses and have lectured on universal design across the campus here at ASU in various disciplines.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. And again, welcome to all of our participants. Just one last reminder that we are simultaneously translating into Arabic. That can actually be found by selecting the Spanish channel in Zoom. You can find that icon as a globe in the lower right-hand corner of your screen. So I'd like to invite our panelists to begin their presentation. Throughout the presentation, we will be pausing for dialogue and questions, but please note that this is an excellent presentation and we will be sending out copies of this and the recording following the session. So please, thank you very much.
Well, welcome. We are so happy to be here with you today. Thank you for the pleasure of sharing this content with you. Today, we're going to be talking about universal design for learning, definitions, methods, and applications. On the next slide, we're going to share our goals. The two primary goals of this webinar are to deepen faculty's understanding of the universal design for learning framework, and to support faculty in applying the framework to support the success of diverse learners within coursework and also assessment. Why? Why is UDL important? The law demands that all learners have right to an education. The principles of UDL help ensure the learning environment is made accessible to all learners and that all learners are able to adequately participate. Using UDL principles is not only our legal responsibility as faculty, but also our moral responsibility. So fundamentally, as John will touch on later in our conversation, UDL is not only about equity, it is about empathy. It helps ensure access, participation, and progress in the course or degree of study for all learners. This is especially true right now during times of COVID.
So I want to begin by just really basically defining what universal design is, and I will use the original definition that came out of the Center for Universal Design in the US by Ronald Mace. Universal design, the design of products and environments to be usable by all people to the greatest extent possible without the need for adaptation or specialized design. Now, this refers to being universal, and it is different from design for disability in that we aren't specializing on a particular disability or a particular group of people. In fact, we are looking at the entire group of people that are going to be involved in any situation that you are working or in. So, of course, universal design has a lot to do with people with disabilities, but in universal design, we like to use the term different abilities. Rather than separating the them from us, we like to think of the whole population as being a variation of levels of ability. So here is the sort of a bell graph of the population of humans, for example. And most people have been focusing on what is called the average person. Well, that is a fallacy. There is no average person. And in fact, when we look at the total population, we are looking at varying levels that go from the 5th percentile to the 95th percentile. And so in universal design, we're really incorporating the total population, and we call that inclusive design. So again, we're not excluding anyone in this sort of concept of universal design. We're not specializing on any one person. We are including everyone and not excluding anyone. So that is sort of the general premise of universal design. There is a spectrum of which universal design falls under, and anyone sort of practicing universal design should take into account these 7 levels of ability. That would be cognition, right? That would be receiving, comprehending, interpreting, remembering, or acting on information. There is vision, perceiving visual stimuli, detail, focusing, separating color, contrast, and tracking. Hearing and speech, perceiving auditory stimuli, high versus low pitch, for example. Body functions, cardiovascular, musculoskeletal, and central nervous system. Arm functions, abilities in upper extremity range of motion, coordination, and strength. Hand function, that would be grasping, squeezing, rotating, twisting, pinching, pulling, and pushing. And mobility, rising, sitting, standing, walking, running, jumping, climbing, and kneeling are just a few of the things that we need to be focused on and cognizant of when we are looking at trying to be universal. There are many myths about universal design, and I want to cover two of the major ones. The first myth is there are only a small number of people who can benefit from universal design. Thus, we should not let their needs dictate. Well, the fact is that here in the US, 50% of the US population, we have about 328 million here in the US. So that's half of that, 164 million people could be characterized as having some sort of functional limitation. So in other words, even pregnant women and short people or tall people, people with glasses like myself, would fall under that category of having some functional limitation. So we're broadening this idea of disability and turning it into levels of ability that cross over huge amounts of people in the population. Myth number two, there are only a small number of people who can benefit from universal design. Thus, we should not dictate their needs to their needs. And again, universal design extends the benefits of good functional design to many groups of people who are not necessarily classified as having a disability or age, but who routinely encounter functional obstacles in their daily life. So as I mentioned, short people, tall people, large people, frail, pregnant people, parents with children in strollers, visitors in an unfamiliar city. The list goes on in terms of limitations to one's abilities.
So let's consider how we might transition from universal design in architecture to universal design for learning and education. Universal design for learning is one component of the overall movement towards universal design. Universal design for learning is the proactive design of our courses to ensure that they are educationally accessible of learning preferences and physical sensory abilities. Rather than thinking about shelter, universal design for learning is the attempt to make the curriculum fit the student from the beginning, rather than trying to fix the student. On the next slide, you'll see some examples to help make this more clear. This table illustrates the relationship between universal design and universal design for learning. So for example, within universal design, as John shared, we're thinking about the physical environment. Whereas in our instruction, we're considering the instructional environment, the classroom, where we space or put student seats, where the whiteboard or projector is, those types of details. Within universal design, we're considering physical barriers that may exist in the architectural environment. However, in universal design for learning, we're thinking about learning barriers that may exist within the curriculum or related to assessment. Within universal design, it's a proactive design of physical space, like John just shared from the beginning, thinking about accessibility. Whereas in universal design for learning, it's again, proactive design, but related to instruction. And finally, within universal design, physical retrofitting can be costly and not very elegant. It may look kind of different than the vision of the architect because it's done after and as an afterthought. Same with universal design for learning. These types of instructional accommodations at the end, after the course has been designed, after the assessment has been designed, can be very time-consuming for faculty and difficult. And so universal design thinks about the needs of your learners and how you might ensure their success from the very beginning, before even one idea is taught. So if we're kind of looking at this comparison or thinking about the relationship between universal design and universal design for learning, here are two other ways for us to make this more clear. If a building or product is created using the principles of universal design, then it is accessible to almost all people without any modifications. If a faculty member uses universal design for learning framework to design instruction and assessment, The information and the ability to demonstrate their understanding is accessible to almost all students without any modifications or accommodations. I really love this next slide. Take a look at these pictures on the top and think, as I talk about this, about learning variability. The Universal Design for Learning framework is based on cognitive neuroscience. The images on this slide are functional resonance images, fMRI, that capture brain activity patterns of 3 people performing the same simple task of just tapping their finger. It's hard to see, but blue indicates low brain activity. Red indicates high brain activity. You see a little bit more within these pictures. And yellow, which we don't see very much in this image, represents extremely high brain activity. Remember, they're just tapping their finger in this fMRI image. Notice how even with this simple task, people are processing in very different ways. Imagine if we were asking them to do something more complex, or if these were students within your coursework, solving a problem or participating within an activity. So if you look at the next slide and think about UDL, it's really about creating equitable opportunities. When applied to higher education, universal design represents a cohesive approach to promoting inclusion, one that considers on an ongoing basis how curriculum, instruction, and assessment can be designed to meet the needs of the greatest number of students without compromising rigor, so still maintaining that high standard. Equitable and inclusive opportunities, and in order to do this, if you look at our next slide, you'll see that equitable and inclusive opportunities are really achieved through these 3 ideas. To do this, we must provide multiple means of engagement, provide multiple means of representation, and then finally, provide multiple means of action and expression. On the next slide, what we illustrate are the 4 fundamental pillars of universal design for learning. UDL takes good teaching one step further and presses faculty to consider ensuring that student success, or thinking about student success, from the forefront. The pillars include goals, instruction, materials, and assessment. In the slides that follow, we will examine each of these pillars and how it relates to your coursework, design, and implementation. In universal design for learning, the instruction, instructional materials, and activities make the goals achievable for individuals with wide differences in their abilities to see, hear, move, read, write, understand a particular language, attend, organize, engage, and remember. To do this, the instructor must have clear goals. Goals represent the knowledge and skills that all students should master within the course and across the program. Effective goals have 3 characteristics. They separate a means from the end. They challenge all learners so they maintain a high standard and are rigorous. And finally, actively involve all learners. The next pillar is the pillar of instruction. After the instructor has determined what they want the students to achieve, they consider the nature of instruction, decisions, approaches, procedures, and routines to afford the learning necessary for students to achieve learning goals. On this next slide, we have a visual representing these options. Meyer and Rose have developed 3 corresponding instructional frameworks derived from neuropsychological research on the brain and the processes by which it learns. Outlined on this slide are these instructional frameworks and several suggested instructional methods faculty can take for each network. The first network is recognition networks, the what of learning. This network makes it possible to receive and analyze information. Ways that faculty can tailor their instruction within their coursework or program to support students in accessing this network include providing multiple examples, highlighting critical features, providing multiple media and formats. So for example, I may provide, in addition to presenting my content through my voice or through a physical lecture or a video, I may also provide another video or a podcast or even a text material to support students in getting the information from multiple angles. This supports our students in developing their background knowledge and creating connections to what you're teaching and their life experiences and other relevant pieces of information. The next network is the affective network. This is the why of learning. It fuels motivation for our students and supports students in establishing their priorities. Ways that faculty can engage within this network are to offer our students choices on maybe the content that they're studying or the tools they use to do so. Another approach within this to appeal to this network is to offer adjustable levels of challenge. So for example, if one of my students has more experience with the content area than another, I may provide that student some additional challenge to the assignment while keeping the other one. Still, everyone's meeting the same high standard, but one student has a more sophisticated approach than another who's more of a novice. Within this approach, we also consider offering choices or rewards. So again, we appeal to our students' emotion and motivation by allowing them to select what is interesting to them or is appropriate for their context. The final network is the strategic network. This really represents the how of learning. It allows learners to generate patterns and problem solve. Ways that faculty can support students in engaging in this network is by providing flexible models of skilled performance and thinking about what opportunities to practice are we providing our learners. In addition, we might provide flexible opportunities for having our students demonstrate their knowledge. And so this will connect to assessment, which is a slide that we will talk about in several moments. And this is fundamentally the idea of allowing for our students to demonstrate what they know and can do in various different ways.
So
the next pillar.
So yeah. Amber, I'm wondering, as I'm looking at this slide, one of the, I think, provocative challenges with that UDL can present is, how do we do this in a very low tech way, right? How can we do this where there may be minimal opportunities for different types of formatting or other, or other sort of changes that we can make? What is your thoughts on how this might work in what we could call low tech or sort of low availability environments?
Sure, that's a really great question, Stuart. And first, I want to address a question that I see in the chat. And it is related to that this content is universal design for learning is not only for students with disabilities, it is for all learners. And so when we use universal design for learning within our coursework, it ensures that what we are teaching and how we measure our students' understanding is accessible for students with disabilities. However, it profits every single student that we have within our course or within our program. And so one way that I try to think about this is that all of our learners within my college courses come to me with very different life and learning experiences. Some of them are better at school than others. And this kind of helps me ensure that every single student that I work with, whether they have a disability or not, are able to participate effectively and achieve success. Stuart, I really appreciate your question because sometimes it feels overwhelming to think about how we might integrate some of these approaches within our instruction from the beginning. However, your question is really appropriate because there are many low to no tech options that we can do just by thinking about what types of needs or anticipating our students' needs from the beginning while designing a learning experience. For example, I know based on the science of learning that students who are novices, so if I'm teaching a beginning level course, really benefit from explicit instruction with modeling, coupled with opportunities to practice and feedback. I can think about those things while I design the content of my course, and then also think about how I might be representing the information that I present to my students in a variety of different platforms. So for example, a really low tech option might be a lecture. So given the opportunity for us all to be face-to-face, I may present the new content in a conversation by telling my students about the new information and asking them questions. But then I also might provide increased opportunities for them to really transfer that new information into their long-term memory by reading a text that has an example of that information, and then also coupling it with a practice activity where they work with a peer collaboratively around a case study related to that content, or they engage in a lab experiment or some type of work that is fundamentally aligned with the goal I want for students to achieve, the information or the content that I present to them, and then next, an opportunity for them to practice so that they have some time to engage with the content and the curriculum before I assess them to understand if my instruction was effective and if they're achieving mastery on that new content or skill.
I think that's so fascinating, and thank you so much for that response, Amber, because I think it points out, right, that UDL is not burdensome, right? It is, in fact, starting from the perspective of the learner and not trying to say, come up with 35 alternatives, but rather to say, so, and correct me if I'm wrong, but you identified novice and expert as two different sort of areas. So we may always, we may design curriculum or we may design buildings for people with high skill levels in certain physical or cognitive dimensions. And in fact, by just stepping back and saying, what if we made assumptions about, right, lack of experience, right, in a particular topic, or some differences in physical ability, we could easily move forward with a design that incorporates that spectrum.
Absolutely. And just from our webinar today, an example of multiple representations include us sharing with our ideas through our voice, but then also coupling it with the visual representation of the table on this slide and providing examples. That is, I know it sounds like very simple, but us doing those things really support our learners in developing a more clear understanding of what we're wanting for them to accomplish.
Thank you so much.
The next pillar of universal design for learning are the materials. When choosing instructional materials or designing day-to-day activities, ask yourself, do the materials and activities exclude any particular group of learner? So is there someone in your class who may not be able to participate because of their particular needs? Although some students will require accommodations, for example, a student in your class that may have a hearing impairment will still need a sign language interpreter. Faculty who practice universal design for learning will be better prepared to support the success of all learners in their course, including students with disabilities, by considering these needs up front. Many faculty rely heavily on timed assessments. So the next UDL principle is assessment. And I want for you to think about the ways that you traditionally assess learner knowledge within your course. Many of us rely on more traditional approaches. For example, timed assessment, where a student sits, at a desk with the paper pencil test, and they're doing it from rote memory. While appropriate in some disciplines, this approach to capturing student learning or student understanding advantages some students who are free-flowing thinkers, while disadvantaging others. I know myself, it takes me a long time to do things. I am more of a meticulous kind of person who writes everything out and would prefer more time. And so from a universal design for learning perspective, effective assessment has these fundamental features. We think about using multiple techniques. And so perhaps you still choose to use a multiple choice test. However, you may also couple it with open response and even an activity where the students are creating a case study or orally representing their understanding to you through some kind of application. This is really appropriate because it provides our students a variety of different ways to show us that they understand and how they understand to apply their new knowledge. Another feature that's really important is moving beyond just the end of course exam and thinking about ongoing and focused collection of student understanding over time. This is really important for me as a professor or instructor because it allows me to adjust course when I see that my students aren't understanding in the way that I'd expected. And I think, perhaps there's a way I could be more clear to ensuring that my students understand this topic or are able to perform the skill or activity. In addition to understanding what the student knows, I see it as a reflection of myself. It's important for us to measure and understand our students, both the product and the process. And so this is when we ask our students questions or ask them to show them our work so that we can have insight into their thinking underlying an outcome. Another important feature of assessment is that assessments are flexible and not fixed. And so if things are going wrong, as the faculty member, I have the opportunity to adjust course and do things differently based on how my students are performing. I may choose to actually reteach if everyone's having a really difficult time because I made an assumption that my students came to me with a particular skill set or body of knowledge. They are relevant, and so the assessment must be aligned with my learning objective and the content that I teach. And then this last bullet on this slide, I mentioned it previously when I was talking about collecting ongoing and focused information on my students' progress. I use that information, and you too can use that information to inform your instruction and the materials and methods that you choose to teach. On this next slide, I have a little bit of an example. So for example, I shared earlier that I am a teacher of teachers. So I prepare teachers to teach students with disabilities. And currently I'm teaching an advanced assessment course, an advanced methods course. And so if you look at the first row in this table, one of the outcomes, one of the student learning objectives of my course is that my students need to be able to conduct an assessment on an identified student and analyze the results, provide interpretation, and communicate findings to their colleagues, parents, and students. That is a high goal that I expect for every student in my class to achieve. However, just within my class yesterday, while I was teaching my students this particular goal, there were some changes that I needed to adjust. For example, because of COVID, the instructional context of my students are different than what they were last fall. And so I learned that this was a more challenging expectation than what it might be during a different semester. And so the first thing that we we did is we put them in partners to achieve this goal, an activity that I would usually have them do individually. They're doing together because of the conditions in which they're working. So it's still the high standard, but I'm making an adjustment to ensure that every student in my class knows how to do this. But the way that they show me that they have the skill set and knowledge may look different right now than it did last fall when I taught this previously. As I'm providing my students instruction about how to conduct this kind of assessment and how to analyze the results, and then finally communicate it to families and their colleagues, I provide multiple examples and models. So in addition to me telling them and physically showing them how to select a student, provide a body of assessments and interpret that data on like a simulation, I do a simulation. I also provide them different models. And so I have a series of case studies that they can download that have different degrees of excellence. One is and I show them why one is done better than the other, which has less detail or is a little more poor or less defined. When we are showing the students the models and I'm providing and introducing this new instruction for the first time, I highlight the critical features. And in a way that I also do this connects to assessment. I provide my students a rubric of the expectations that I have for them to achieve excellence when developing their own case study around this assessment and this particular learner. And then in addition, while engaging in the instruction, I do allow for the students to make choices. They are within their own they are all placed in different classrooms. And so they have knowledge of who their learners are and what their instructional needs are. And so I allow for my students to choose which student they want to focus on. And then my own students have different preferences and needs related to content areas. So they may want to really enhance their skill for effective instruction and literacy instruction. Those students may choose to focus on learners that have needs in reading, while others might focus on math or science. When thinking about the materials, I think about the ways that my content is accessible to the students on multiple platforms, which sometimes requires a little more thought for me because I need to think in advance on what I want the students to know and how I'm going to communicate it to them. It may mean that I pre-record myself in a video that they watch in advance of our lecture, or I select some type of text that my students read before they join me so that they can have some background knowledge to participate more effectively within our conversation. When I do teach, especially right now in Zoom, most of our instruction is remote. I record myself so students can watch again and again the content or have access to it at another time. When teaching face-to-face, I also provide my students the same option. Many of the students have their phones and they'll just record the audio of our teaching while we're providing it so they can listen to it at another time. But here in the platform of Zoom and virtual instruction, I'm able to anticipate that that's a need of many of my students and the need of repetition. And so I can record myself in time or advance. I also support my students with guided notes. And so this means I provide them an outline of what they might expect to learn during our time together, during our lesson. A really effective way for us to structure this is to leave things blank with a main heading. And so students are expecting for us they're expecting to hear something from us, but then they have to listen and attend to complete what is missing within those notes. And then again, supplementing or aligning my instruction with the text, whether it be a research article or a handbook. Finally, when thinking about how my students understand, so the ways that they're able to demonstrate that they can achieve the goal of conducting an assessment on an identified student and analyze the results from this and communicate it with others, there are several ways that I have them share their knowledge. The first is through a written report where the students create a case study. Again, they're working with partners. And so they develop a case study on a profile of a learner from their student teaching experience. And then another way that I have them demonstrate what they know is they have to talk about it. So now they've written it down. They work with a different peer and they simulate a parent-teacher conference where they relay the information garnered from the assessment and the analysis to a, a parent of the potential student. There's many ways that we can apply these pillars of the universal design for learning to our coursework. And I'm hopeful that as I was kind of talking through some of the ways that I use these features within my own instruction, you too were having ideas about how you could apply these principles to your own coursework and programs. Next, John is going to talk about another approach that really centers empathy.
So someone asked a question earlier in the comments about training. How does one get some training in universal design? And the training really begins with just trying to be empathetic to the student condition, as well as everybody else that's involved in the learning environment. So I want a basic definition of empathy is the action of understanding, being aware of, being sensitive to, and vicariously experiencing the feelings, thoughts, and experience of another of either the past or present without having the feelings, thoughts, and experience fully communicated in an objectively explicit manner. So in other words, having not experienced something, but imagining what that feeling would be like from that person's perspective. To achieve empathy, right, I'm going to offer a particular methodology that anybody can adopt in their perspectives of teaching. And this is an accounting scheme. It's a social science methodology that is used to understand and observe people. And an accounting scheme is basically a method used to organize and analyze information about a given problem or situation. I'd like to offer the method of the A by 4, which is looking at the 4 A's. And this is called the actors, activities, artifacts, and atmosphere methodology. When you look at these 4 different perspectives, right, you'll gain a better empathy for the people that you're focused on, specifically in the case of instructional design, the learner. So in the A by 4, we look at the actors. And what does that mean? That we're looking at everybody in the classroom or in the learning situation, right? We think about who the people are and their needs or issues. I use the term people because we're not just focused solely on the student. We're looking at the teacher as well. We're not trying to marginalize anybody that's going to be in that classroom. We might also have visitors. We might also have parents that are concerned. So it's looking at all the actors involved in any given situation. There are main actors and supporting actors, and then there are actors that are just there, on the stage, right? It's very similar to acting in this sense, where you have to look at all of the people involved in your learning environment as actors and look at all the different types of actors that are available in that environment. And you're looking at their needs or issues. The next A is activities. You want to think about the actors, what the actors do and how they do what they do, right? So looking at all those variety of actors, from the teacher to the student to all the other types of teachers, all the other types of students as actors that could exist in a classroom. And you want to think about how they go about doing what they do and their activities specifically. The next A is the artifacts. And you want to think about what things or devices will enable the actor to achieve their desired goal. Now, when I say devices, I mean any artifact. That it could be a sheet of paper, it could be a textbook, it could be a computer, it could be just words on a chalkboard and the chalk itself. But those are all the tools, all the things that we use in the classroom that we would see as artifacts. They could simply be messages or just instructions or handouts or visuals or something that is just handed through in the classroom to help as a teaching aid. These are all the artifacts that would exist in this particular situation. And we want to think about all those artifacts in terms of how do they enable the actors to achieve their activities, in this case, learning. The fourth and one of the most important aids that we have to look at in the A/4 method is atmosphere. And atmosphere isn't purely focused on the physical environment, that meaning the chairs, the desks, the room, the windows, and all of that, but it also looks at the emotional atmosphere. So we're both looking at the psychological, emotional perspective as well as the physical environment. And those two combine together to create an appropriate or well-designed instructional environment. So, you know, it's always good when you want to be able to practice empathy to provide a challenge. So you could gain a lot of empathy by just sort of congregating faculty together and joining in to create an experience, more of a thought experiment in terms of empathy. And so posing a challenge is really great to a group of faculty in terms of practicing empathy through the A/4. So in this case, here's an example of a type of challenge that I would present to a group of faculty. How might we create a universally designed college classroom where 50% of the people in the room have varying levels of ability? Now remember, I mentioned earlier with universal design, we're not focused on any particular disability. We really want to see an entire population as having a variation in abilities. When you look at people in that term, it's much more broad and inclusive, right? We're not specializing and accommodating for any one particular people, because what that does is it oftentimes isolates other people in the population, right? And it marginalizes others, right? What we're trying to do in a universal design, especially in the application of learning, is looking at the population in terms of being inclusive, right? You want to be able to involve all people at the highest level of their abilities, right? And engage them on those levels. And so a challenge like this is if we know that 50% of the people in that classroom, both teachers, parents, students, anybody else that might be in that classroom, that assistants, you know, anyone else that are teachers' aides, all those people have varying levels of ability. And if we look at that population and say, well, half of them are going to have certain limitations, how would we design that classroom? You provide that kind of challenge and then engage in the A/4. So, as I mentioned, you assign teams. So I would say, get together with several faculty and staff, and you join together in teams of 4. Teams of 4 are really great for this type of activity. And then you engage each of the teams to list up all of the actors, all of the activities, all of the artifacts, and the types of atmosphere that will exist in this kind of a classroom. So in essence, what they're doing is they're designing a classroom with the perspective of looking at a variety of different abilities. And so you want to make sure that you monitor these teams of faculty, right? You want to say that you want to make sure that they are exhausting all the possible actors, right? You want to make sure that they're not just going to come up with teacher and student in their list of actors. They have to provide a huge list of all the different types of students, all the different types of faculty, teachers and assistants and helpers that will be in that classroom, and list up more specifically of who they are. And then you want to look at, based on all of that, those different types of actors, what were all the different types of activities that could go on in a classroom based off of those actors. And then you engage in looking at all the artifacts. So, and all of those things that relate back to those actors and the activities that they wish to do. Lastly, you look at the entire atmosphere of that kind of classroom. What types of atmosphere do we want to have? You know, in certain given learning situations, you might want to have a relaxed sort of time to reflect. In other situations where you want to have a more active, participatory situation, depending on what the learning situation is. And so you want to look at all the varieties of both physical and emotional, psychological environment that will exist in a given classroom on any given day. And so this activity really forces the participants to look at all of the variety of actors and start to think about their perspectives and what they do, and all the things that help support them in terms of the artifacts. And of course, in the end, the overall varying types of atmosphere that will exist in a classroom. This will eventually build empathy about people that they might not have thought of that would exist in this classroom, specifically if the challenge is as specific as the one that I've given as the example, where 50% of the people will have varying levels of ability. Now, obviously, you could make that more of a specific challenge where you're looking at any specific disability. But in general, in universal design, we want to be able to look at all the variety of people that could potentially exist in a learning environment. Then you want to be able to facilitate that empathy by making sure that the teams consider those 7 levels of ability that I mentioned earlier, the universal design spectrum, from cognition all the way to mobility. And look at that in terms of all of the actors, not just the students. In other words, including any person who will be in that classroom, whether teacher, helper, parent, or student, and who else, right? Finally, after the activity, you want to get the groups back together and share their experiences in terms of their empathy for the people that could potentially be in this classroom. So you get everybody back together and you share those experiences on the empathy that you talked about, and then what other ideas that you came up with in order to explain what that classroom would be like. So we are designing in sort of a thought experiment of what this classroom or what this curriculum or what this instruction would be like, and reflecting on that as a group. I find that this kind of activity is really helpful in regardless of the situation that I'm teaching this particular methodology, in really helping people to become empathetic to other situations of other people by literally getting them to think of themselves as that person. And I think now we would like to move on to any kinds of questions or comments that the audience has.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, John and Amber, for all of the information that you've shared. We've been tracking a lot of these questions in the chat. We encourage all of our participants to use the chat or the Q&A function to share any questions that you have. And as we wait for questions to come in, just taking a moment, I think, to maybe summarize what my own understanding really of what we've talked about today, and to start with this fact that all of this really derives from the desire to empathize with the broadest spectrum of people, and to start from that empathetic understanding of the learners that we will work with, the people we will be inviting into physical spaces, and to begin from that perspective rather than our own preconceived notions, right? So we're breaking down the preconceptions we might have, and instead actually connecting to the real learner, the real user, the real people who will be affected by our buildings, our courses, our spaces, etc. Does that seem right to the two of you?
Absolutely.
And And as we sort of look at that, in addition to some of the things that you've offered, for example, Amber, I know that you were a lead author on a really wonderful piece about collecting information about special education learners that I read once. It was you and 3 other authors. Can you share a bit about the methods that you've used for collecting, for developing empathy for your learners, both in higher education as well as in the K-12 context?
Sure. Thank you, Stuart. Okay, so I think what you're asking is what are the ways that I understand my students' understanding?
Mm-hmm.
How do I know if my students are learning or if they're making progress toward the goals that we've set for them within our coursework? And so there's many ways for us to do this with children, but when thinking about adults as learners, many of those same approaches apply. And so the thing that I think we sometimes forget is that grown-ups are learners too. And within your coursework at the university level, you will be teaching students that are from the ages of 18 and plus, and perhaps even non-traditional learners that are joining you for the first time because they're choosing to change their degree or start a new career or learn something new. And so when thinking about how we might understand our students' understanding, assessment is a really important approach or part of this, and collecting data on the degree to which they understand. So there's many different ways that we do this. Sometimes it's informally. So a way that I might do this is while I'm providing a lecture. Just like today, I might ask my students to summarize what they think is the most important idea. And so if they bring forward and are able to use their own words or language to tell me what they think I wanted for them to accomplish, that's information about the student's understanding. In addition to having conversation and talking about their understanding of the content, putting it in their own words through conversation. I would also want them to ask questions that connect, help them create connections to what they're learning within my course, with other courses, as well as their lived experiences, their background experiences. All of that is information that helps me understand how well they are hanging with me, how well and effective I've been at providing this new information. Those are informal ways. There are other informal ways. For example, I might have a quick exit ticket. So before I transition to a new part of my lecture or a new part of provide new information within the course, I might have everyone take a Post-it note. That's an example of low tech, and have them write down 3 things that they learned that they think is really important about the idea that I shared. And then I'll collect it because I'll want to look to see, are they understanding? Are the points that they summarized or highlighted also the key pieces of information that I know are essential for them to be successful in achieving their goals? So there are things that we can do informally in the act of teaching to kind of get a pulse on how well they're paying attention and making sense of the new information. Also, all of those learning opportunities that you design after you introduce that new content is information about your students' processing and mastery of the content and skills. Another way to think about these learning opportunities in higher education is usually as assignments or activities. And so I want to make sure that every activity and assignment that I design is aligned in a focused way with my learning objective and is dynamic in a way that has my students either working in a partnership to solve a problem, maybe presents information in the form of a case study which is kind of a written report, but what they're doing is synthesizing a lot of information that is an application of what they've learned from me, not just rote presentation of their or retrieval of their content knowledge. And then at the end, there may or may not be some kind of cumulative assessment. And so at the end of the course, I want to ensure that the students have learned these things, that I've been successful at teaching them these student learning outcomes. And there may be a performance-based assessment. So you may ask your student to do something. And this may also be aligned with a practice opportunity that you do previously. So they're building up to this more complex task where they're bundling maybe multiple skills and strategies and content knowledge from across the course within one type of outcome. That maybe it's an oral presentation. Maybe they create, if you're in a teacher education course, maybe they create professional development for a colleague or other teachers at their school, and they present it to our class as if they are providing the professional development to their peers. There are many ways for us to think about collecting information on our students that are beyond a paper pencil test and occur during the act of teaching, during the process of practice, as well as at the end as a cumulative experience and a more formal assessment.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. John, a question for you that has come up in the Q&A, which has to do with the place of feedback in universal design for learning. And I think oftentimes when we're thinking about feedback, right, it is only between teacher and student. But I'm wondering if you could maybe help us expand our view by thinking of the other actors or even the other elements of the environment that could provide feedback in this kind of system.
Yeah, I think this type of activity is really something that helps to develop an understanding, and I think that understanding of the entire classroom situation will provide that level of feedback needed when you get back into the active real classroom. I think the simulation aspect of this methodology really does help in training everyone in terms of looking at the universality of education and how to increase that. I think the idea here is not to specialize or not to look at any one particular need and looking at a variety of different needs that increase the activity for everyone. I think it's a very inclusive type of activity in which you're able to experiment and that. I think the actual feedback happens when you take that empathy and that learning from these types of reflections as faculty back into the classroom and again, experiment. I think Amber mentioned many types of examples in which you can change your perspective, change the curriculum, change the way that you are getting that kind of interaction with your students, so that you can actually see that feedback in terms of the learning environment. Was the assignment more successful by providing those different modes of interaction in that classroom? Were the assignments or the activities much more beneficial to everyone as a total, not just looking at any one person per se, but looking at the total environment? I think the basic premise of universal design is design for all. We're trying to look at how to improve the entire situation through making everyone benefit from it. I think the general theory behind universal design is that everyone benefits from it. If I were to really be cognizant of any particular level of ability and make adjustments to broaden that learning in that environment, it would actually benefit even the people that you might not think are going to be even affected by that, because it really does create better design. I think I've talked to many experts in universal design, And they say the ultimate goal of universal design is that we don't actually have universal design. And when I first heard that, I thought that was actually strange. And they responded that universal design at some point, hopefully, will disappear because it's all about just good design. It's about having really great instructional design that doesn't have to worry about making sure that everybody's included, because from the start, we are very inclusive about how we go about teaching and doing what we have to do in that classroom. Amber, do you have anything else to add regarding that?
No, I really liked how you talked about really good, really strong universal design, and really strong universal design for learning begins at the beginning of us thinking about what we want for our students to achieve. And that if we do it really well, we won't have to make accommodations or modifications during course, because we've already thought or anticipated all of the likely barriers from the beginning, that will ensure that we really have an inclusive class, and that is and that every student within our class has the opportunity to learn and be successful.
You know, we've just experienced the anniversary of the ADA, Adults with Disabilities Act here in the US. And it was a great thing that this was put into institutionalized for the country. But we want to be able to see that Adults with Disabilities Act is a real minimum. It's the most minimum that we can do to look at disabilities and include them into the bigger picture. What universal design is really pushing way beyond and above the basic adults for disabilities and looking at the total population and how we can improve the entire environment. And so we're not excluding those disabilities. We're not focusing on them either. We are looking at it as an inclusiveness to everyone in that classroom. So yeah, I think that there was another question about how does this fit into ADA? And again, I think it's really elevating ADA beyond just the bare minimum of accommodations that we have to make for people with disabilities, and looking at how can we improve the entire situation and benefit everyone without sacrificing or marginalizing anyone in that room.
Such an important consideration, regardless of time or place, right? Is this inclusion of all and starting from this empathetic viewpoint. I know in listening to the conversation, it can be challenging to sort of feel like, what is the way in to UDL? And because it could feel, I suppose, like it's an all or nothing, right? Like you're either designing for universal learning or you're not, right? So you're either encompassing everyone or you're not. And I'm wondering, in what sense is UDL an incremental process, right? In what sense is it something that one builds on over time and gains more and more capacity for, right? Is there kind of growth in our ability to apply UDL in both our classes and in spaces? What are your thoughts on that, kind of how people grow into a UDL mindset?
Well, I'll begin if that's okay, John, and maybe you can enhance some of my reflections. I think, Stuart, it's really important for no one on this call to feel overwhelmed. I've been monitoring the chat throughout our conversation, and I'm noticing that many of you are already doing some of the things that are included within Universal Design for Learning. So for example, the Kahoots, the technology of taking a quick check or a quick poll on the ways that your students may be understanding some new content that you that you just introduced. That's an example of Universal Design for Learning. And I think if you analyze your practice, the curriculum, the activities, the assessments that you've engaged your students in, there's probably a lot of things that you're already doing that are aligned to the UDL principles and framework. And so I think the purpose of our conversation today is to take a moment for us all to reflect and see kind of where you set with these different principles. Maybe you've been doing these things, but haven't had the language or the framework to help you organize or structure yourself. And then now, after you do, now we have this common language, we have this common understanding of the ways that we can think about intentionally how to make our instruction and assessments more accessible to all of our learners. You can think about areas where you might target for growth. And these areas will surface for us also, like in advance. There are some things that you can think of probably right away that you might choose to do differently based on our conversation. However, over time, the more you teach, the more experience you have with your curriculum, you're going to better know your learners and better be able to anticipate their errors or the areas of the content or the skills or strategies that you're teaching them that are difficult for them. And I think also through conversations with our colleagues, a lot of these difficulties surface. And so I know for myself, the second time I taught the course, I was able to reflect on the first time I taught it and think right from the beginning about areas that not just one student or three students had a hard time with, but a good majority of them, and think about how to represent my ideas differently and in different ways to engage the learners in practice that may be more dynamic or engaging, and also help them represent their ideas and skill sets in different ways. And so I think be gentle on yourself and know that this is a process, and we're just beginning, but you've already begun and you didn't even know it, maybe.
Yeah, to add to that, I really like the term reflection, and we've tried to emphasize that in this presentation today. We call this a reflective practitioner, right? I was once told by a veteran teacher when I first started that if you're not actually looking back and reflecting on your course each semester, even though you've designed it and you've implemented it and you've taught it several times, if you're not actually reflecting after each time you teach it and improving it, then that course itself is not growing, it's not evolving. And you as a teacher aren't evolving. And so I've always tried to employ that as regardless of how well I feel I've designed a particular course, that I'm constantly reflecting on it and I'm trying to improve upon it. And yes, it is an incremental stage that we go through to get better and better. I think the goal is just we're trying to create better teaching or instructional design. The better design that we can come up with, it can always be improved. And that's true with as a practicing designer. Your design is never over, it's never finished, it's always can be improved, and you can always go back to it and make it better. And I think some faculty make huge leaps at a time, and others take a lot more time to engage, and these are more incremental steps to reflect on. But it doesn't really matter what your pace is as long as you're moving forward.
Thank you so much for that. So the recognition that elements of universal design for learning are already evident, and that it is an ongoing reflective and reflexive practice, right? To continue to empathize with our learners, right? And to continue to evolve our tools of setting goals, of instruction, of assessment, and materials.
Yeah, someone mentioned in the questions about lifelong learning, and yes, I think that this is an integral part of this whole process.
Mm-hmm. So one question that is a recurring question has to do with how does UDL work in a sense with larger groups? So when we're thinking about maybe teaching a class of 16 to 10 students, the empathy process in this work can feel very manageable. But if I have a large lecture with 50 to 100 to 200 students, the ability to empathize specifically seems to be very difficult. So how does this maybe play out at the large class size level? And maybe John, would you mind starting, and then Amber?
Well, I think, when you've got, let's say, a huge lecture hall and you've got upwards of 400 students in a lecture, and you have massive amounts of information that you're going to be lecturing on over a semester long. Yeah, that's much more difficult because of the greater numbers of people. I would assume that that would be more in tune with how are you engaging through the lecture series as a total, and then breaking it down to each lecture individually. Do you take time to get interaction with the students rather than just droning on and explaining something, that you take time for activities to engage students in the learning process, so that it doesn't become just an audience and a lecture at in the front and the stage. I think that you have to, the empathy goes from looking at those students as a, I mean, I've done lectures where, you know, the very front of the audience, they're very engaged. And then I look toward the middle and I see people on their laptops. And then I look toward the back and people maybe even asleep. And of course, we want to be able to have empathy for all those people. That person in the back of the room, they just see a tiny person and maybe a somewhat large screen, and they have less of an interaction with the teacher, whereas the person up front has a much more interactive experience with the person giving the lecture. And so it's really looking at that classroom situation from every perspective possible. Looking at why is that person sleeping, for example, would be a great exercise. And then finding ways to be able to engage that person so that they can have a somewhat similar experience to that person sitting up in front. Amber, do you have anything else to add to that?
I think those are all really great recommendations. Another thing that I tell faculty members to consider are to think about like the profile of different learners. Although it's impossible and daunting to tailor or individualize your instruction to 100 students who are all sitting in that big lecture, you can kind of expect for some of the learners within that class to have similar types of challenges. And so when we think about what kind of difficulties some of our students might experience, so thinking about a profile of a learner that has, if we go to that slide where we have all of the different characteristics we'll be sending out the materials to later, to someone that struggles with maybe focus and they get distracted really easily. I might do certain things. I might expect that there's probably a handful of students in my class that also struggle with attention. And so for that reason, I might just, I won't make my lecture 3 hours long. I'll break it up into shorter segments. I might integrate something like a movement activity or a collaborative activity in between. And I can promise you that the things that I do to help the profile of the learner that has difficulty attending is also going to help their peer who's sitting next to them, who doesn't struggle with attention, but then, you know, was up late last night and is tired. And so some of the things that we can do when we start to think about like ways that different learners may be challenged will also be the things that help our other students. And then also, it is realistic for faculty members. We know the burden. We are faculty members, so we know the burden of your work. There's a lot of competing priorities that you're balancing at the same time. And so sometimes when you hear this new information, it feels overwhelming. I encourage you to start small with things that are manageable for you. For example, if I was thinking about that neural network that relates to emotion and motivation, the affective network, and creating motivation comes from choice. Here it is. Instead of offering every single student a choice of doing 100 different things, I might structure it in a way where I give them 3 options, all that are aligned with my focus, with the focus of my goal and content, but has them, provides them a pathway that is personalized to their preference and also their profile of unique learning needs. So for example, one group of students may choose to give an oral presentation. Another group of students may choose to write a more traditional report, while the third, they are excited about technology, and so they go and decide to create a video or a podcast still all showing me as their faculty member that they have achieved the student learning goals, that they understand and have mastered the content and strategies that are expected of them. But then they're doing so in a way that is aligned with their learning needs. And that 3 options is more manageable than 100 when we have these large classes. So I think there's ways for us to make it manageable given the burden of your hard work. And we know that you're all working so hard.
Wonderful. Well, first, on behalf of the sponsors of this presentation, let me again thank you, Amber and John, for such an important conversation, such a great presentation, and for setting such a wonderful stage for our subsequent conversations we'll be having around universal design for learning. So thank you very much.
Thank you for having me.
Of course,
Yeah.
Thank you. So for our participants, we've seen several questions in the chat around assessment. You'll be pleased to know that our subsequent webinars in this series will actually be focused on designing assessments under universal design for learning. So please stay tuned for those webinar. Our next one is next month. And for any unanswered questions we have in the chat, we do sometimes have the ability to answer these after the session. So we will do that as much as we can. And of course, a recording of this session will be made available to both the participants today and will be available to anyone who would like to review it. Both Dr. Benedict and Dr. Takamura are faculty at Arizona State University, so please feel free to find them on the ASU website. They are both very accomplished scholars and practitioners, and welcome additional questions and feedback from you, both on the presentation and on the content itself. I will say that to the individual who asked what makes an attractive course, I believe it is well worth everyone's time to hear Dr. Takamura's view on the purpose of beauty in universal design. It was very touching, an article that I read in our ASU Now newsletter about this, and it informs a lot of the design decisions that I do in my own work. So again, thank you very much. All participants today will receive a certificate of completion that we will be sending out to registered participants. We will also be offering a digital badge for participants who are able to attend 4 or more of these sessions. So please look for this additional information on the flyer. Again, on behalf of the U.S. Embassy in Morocco and Arizona State University, thank you so much, everyone, for being here, and have a wonderful rest of your day and week. Thank you all.